enthuse and motivate young research scholars and had infused new ideas and programs into the renowned institution. In view of this, after his unexpected demise 5 years ago, the Asiatic Society of Mumbai has set up the Dr. Arun Tikekar Center for Advanced Studies to honor his remarkable work and carry forward its tradition. The well-wishers of the Asiatic Society, friends and family of Dr. Tikekar had helped for setting up this center. This center is dedicated to nurturing scholars and generating research in a number of fields associated with Dr. Tikekar. Scholars, academics, researchers, and others are invited to apply for this prestigious fellowship. They are given some topics and they have to choose one of them and are allowed to write in either Marathi or English. Both the languages Dr. Tikekar had mastered. Duration of the fellowship is 1 year and the researcher will be awarded a total amount of rupees 1.25 lakh. We have decided at the center that a jury comprising eminent people and experts in the subjects will select the scholar or researcher for that particular year. This year's jury panel comprised of Mr. Bhanu Kade, Dr. Rajiv Naik, Dr. Suhas Kulkarni, and subject experts were Ranjit Hoskote and Dr. Sunanda Mahajan. We received a good response for this for all 5 years. Let me just brief to you about this, the winners as well as their topics, so you can have an idea how the subjects were varied. The fellows who were awarded the fellowship for these years were, first year, Suhas Bahulkar. His topic was History of Bombay Presidency, the revivalist of Bombay school tradition. Second year, Ajay Kautikwar got the award and his topic was Challenges of Journalism, Technology and Social Media. Third year was the topic for food culture and social culture. Dr. Manjusha Deshpande won that and her topic was Forgotten Food Items, Impact of Migration and Urbanization. And last year, Mr. Daljit Singh Ami had won the award and his topic proposal was Translation, Quest for Common Reading Public. Now, in the fourth year, along with this fellowship activity, the center we have tried to reach out to the college students by way of interactive lectures and presentations based on the Bombay Presidency, namely the making of Bombay. We have arranged the lectures of the expert lecturers like Dr. Kurush Dalal and Advocate Rajan Jaikar. With the help of the teaching faculty in the colleges, we could reach out to the 3 well-known colleges of Mumbai, namely the Wilson College, the Sophia College, and the Ruia College. The response of the students was very good and encouraging for us. This year, of course, we had planned so much more, but as all of us know, due to this pandemic situation, it was not possible to reach out to the colleges. Hope this year in 2021, we will be able to again activate these things or enrich this program, this center's program in advance. Hope to continue. Now, this year's awardee, Ms. Zai Vipra, who will be giving her presentation. I take this opportunity to appeal to you all to come forward to help to spread these activities. And as all of you have earlier also helped us, will help in future also. Thank you and welcome to you all.
Thank you, Minatai. Very concise and precise welcome address. Now, I would like to request Professor Suhas Parshikar, our chief guest of this evening, to officially announce and present this year's fellowship, to 2021. Professor Parshikar.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. It gives me great pleasure in announcing this year's Dr. Arun Tikekar Fellowship, which has been awarded to Ms. Jai Vipra for her intended work on libraries in particular, but particularly on the topic of public libraries in this time of digitalization. I need not dwell upon the importance of this topic, particularly in this time when people for the last few months have been cooped up in their homes, and the digital universe has sort of overtaken all of us. But I'm sure the importance of public libraries in Marathi, which is usually described, and in all cities and towns of Maharashtra, you will find these Sarvajanik Vachanalayas. These Sarvajanik or public libraries is an important resource, which is not merely constrained to books, but it is also a cultural place of happening in most towns and cities. On behalf of the Tikekar Fellowship Committee, as well as the Asiatic Society, I congratulate the recipient of the award, and all of us would keenly look forward to receiving better insights on how public libraries play an important role in our lives and our cultural lives in particular when the report is ready. Congratulations and thank you.
Thank you, sir. And congratulations to Ms. Jai Vipra. I would like to now invite you to make your brief presentation on your fellowship project. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Suhas, sir, for your remarks, and thank you to the committee and the jury. I'll just give a quick run through of the project while respecting the time limit. So I want to start by talking about the digital economy, because when we think about how large technology companies now run everything, we tend to think about social media, and today's Twitter suspensions are a recent example. We've all been concerned about the outsized ability of social media companies to control the public conversation and their open disrespect for our privacy as well. But it is not just social media. Rapidly, digital technology is becoming the foundational technology that runs every sector of the economy, whether in healthcare, finance, education, or retail. And you will find an element of digital technology that is being used in each of these sectors. Data is essential to this new kind of decision making. Data is used to make small decisions, like the most optimal route to deliver groceries in a neighborhood, to big decisions like how to organize a global supply chain to make it more efficient. Monsanto Bayer, for example, now calls itself a data company, as do many of the world's largest companies, no matter what their core business is. Data companies now sit at the top of global value chains. That is, they capture most of the value that is being produced globally. And they use both personal and non-personal data to aid their decision making. Just as a quick primer, personal data can be things like your name, your weight, where you eat daily. It is linked to you. Non-personal data can be things like the weather data, traffic data collected on taxi apps, etc. Even aggregated personal data can become non-personal data if it is anonymized, that is, if it cannot be linked to specific persons. Now, recently, the government set up a committee to look into the issue of non-personal data and what to do with it. The committee has said that this data is valuable and the people about whom the data is have some right over that data. So Uber by itself does not own all the traffic data it generates. Since we are the traffic and our actions generate that data for Uber, we also have some rights over it. We can decide how this data should and should not be used. So the committee's proposal is to say, for example, to Uber, that the very granular data you have collected and that you refuse to share with competitors or even with the public, that data is not your private property, such that you can just enclose it. we have some rights over that data because it is about us. But we do not want that data to be taken and just given to the state. We know the problems with the state holding people's data instead of big corporations. Sometimes the consequences can be worse when the state holds it. There can be surveillance and bias if the state is given access to all data. So the committee has recommended the creation of data trusts to hold people's data at different levels and to use it in the people's benefit. In some instances, the government too can be a data trust, but in most instances, other organizations, for instance, workers' unions, farmers' organizations, or schools, are more suited for this purpose. Coming finally to my proposal, which is based on a few small examples of trials I've seen, is to explore the possibility of libraries becoming one of the data trusts for the city. The International Federation of Library Associations had made a similar proposal a few years ago. It makes sense because libraries are naturally suited to this, as they already have that quasi-public positioning and the orientation towards information management. And like Suhasa said, they're already a cultural center for the city. And perhaps this can be the way in which libraries really take up an important role. This is something that goes beyond just the digitization of books and archives or new systems of management. So I have for now narrowed down on 3 libraries to study in India based on their prominence and diversity of public-private. But this list is open to change. These are the Government of Karnataka's Public Library, the State Central Library of Kerala, and the Asiatic Society of Mumbai Library. I will study the risks as well as opportunities in making libraries data trusts or data custodians. For instance, questions like what are the biggest issues likely to crop up if a library has to suddenly start thinking of itself as a data trust? Will it be issues of privacy, of security, administration, capacity, or cost? What kinds of data should the library hold in trust, and what kinds of data should it absolutely stay away from? How can it engage with private technology service providers? Should it do that? Or how can it develop its own in-house technological capacity? I will study the governance framework required to make this happen. For instance, what is the role that the local government can play? How can the library ensure that it has enough public engagement and yet does not get captured by vested interests? In other words, how can a library with such wide powers toe the line between independence and public accountability? I'll also study how this is likely to reshape the relationship of the library to the city. I expect to come up with a proper framework to analyze all these questions. The fieldwork, as it were, will include speaking to library administrations, experts, and also speaking to some state and local government officials who have carried out digital infrastructure building projects before. The main challenge I see in this project is one that narrowing the scope while making meaningful contributions is a little difficult, and being able to speak to as many people involved in running libraries as possible is crucial to the project. It is different from the usual, what appear to me excellent and thorough academic papers that the fellowship enables, because the literature on this topic, specific topic, is sparse, but I will be consulting the general literature on libraries as institutions, on digital infrastructure, and on community data. Nevertheless, this project, as I see it, will be a small step in claiming the digital age for the people rather than for multinational corporations. If we can figure out one type of institution that lets us be the arbiters of our information, and that helps us navigate the contradictions of collective decision making to ensure that groups of people or certain people don't get left behind, then we can take steps towards not letting the digital age be yet another age of uncontrolled accumulation and repression. Thank you all again for your support and faith.
Yeah, so thank you, Zai. I mean, your topic has been as relevant and as contemporary as it can be. So you raised our curiosity now, and we are eagerly looking forward to your completion of the project and a scintillating presentation same day next year. So thank you once again, and wish you a best towards your project completion. I would now move to our next speaker, which is Dr. Rajiv Naik. Rajiv Naik is doctorate in linguistics and a man of many parts. Scholar, playwright, critic, poet, short story writer, translator, theorist, and a hugely popular teacher. He is recipient of prestigious awards such as Dr. Homi Bhabha Fellowship and Sangeet Natak Academy Award. We are fortunate to have him as a core jury since the inception of the Tikekar Fellowship. And let me tell you, Rajiv is a candid speaker. So I invite him to speak. Rajiv Naik.
Sir,
Rajiv?
please unmute yourself.
Rajiv, do we have Rajiv or have we lost him?
No. He's there, but he needs to unmute himself. Oh, I think he's gone now, just now. Looks like he logged himself out.
Oh, okay.
He must have logged himself out.
He's there.
Hello.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? Can
Go ahead.
no? Hello.
Yes, Rajiv, go ahead. Can we unmute him? He seemed to be
I
muted.
can only ask him to unmute. I can't unmute him. Yes. Sir, please unmute yourself. Yes, he's there. What is happening?
Rajiv?
Hello.
Yes, Rajiv, go ahead.
No.
Yes, please go ahead.
No.
Rajiv, please go ahead.
Sorry then.
Yeah.
Go on. Carry on. Go on.
Go on, Rajiv. We can see you now. Please unmute. You have to unmute yourself. Please put your speaker on.
I think he has some network issue.
Okay. We'll just give a minute more.
Hello.
Yes, Rajiv, can you go ahead?
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Oh, I'm horribly sorry for this technical error. Sorry. Namaskar. I begin. I am very honored to be associated with the Asiatic Society and Dr. Arun Tikekar fellowships. Arun Tikekar was a friend of my father. He was a friend of my elder brother. He was my friend. And he was a person who, whenever we used to meet, would always ask me, "What are you doing? Are you doing anything? What are you writing?" And I hope these fellowships also would generate that kind of respect and what we call vachak in Marathi. I had that kind of a feeling about Dr. Tikekar, and I hope that even the fellowships have generate that kind of a vachak, that kind of an awe, respect. It was very nice working with all the members of the jury. They were wonderful, they were kind. The scrutiny used to be very precise there was a lot of hard work gone into the scrutiny every year, and the members were very nice to be very to accommodate me and my candid views, as Vilas puts it. The quantity and the quality of the proposals received have been increasing every year. I am slightly afraid that the quantity has increased more than the quality, but that is true about all fellowships, I should say. I hope that more scholarship is put into the proposals than excitement. Sorry for this, but this would be the opinion of any jury member in the world, anywhere. I am especially thankful for the council members, and especially Dr. Meena Vaishampayan. We call her Meena Tai, and it's very proper because she has that sisterly kind of thing. She tolerating me. I'm very thankful for everybody for tolerating me, and I'm extremely hopeful that this fellowship would be one of the sought after and very prestigious fellowships in Bharat. What more to say? I hope to be flooded with such proposals that it would be a challenge to judge them, to select one. That is all that I have to say now. Happy scholarship. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Rajiv. Thanks for your very short but sweet address. We now move on to the most important session of the evening with our chief guest, Professor Suhas Parshikar. Pradeep Champanerkar will introduce the chief guest, Professor Parshikar, and moderator of the session, Ms. Smriti Kopikar. Pradeep is the co-owner director of Rohan Prakashan and my colleague on the management committee for the Tikekar Center, and so also Smriti, who is also colleague on the management committee. So over to Pradeep and Smriti for the next session.
Hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, Pradeep, we can hear you. Yes, Pradeep, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So, good evening, everybody. Here are my few words introducing today's chief guest, Honorable Professor Suhas Parshikar. Professor Suhas Parshikar is a renowned commentator, observer, and analyst of the contemporary politics in India and around. And hence, I think he needs no introduction. However, at the same time, I feel it to be appropriate to make few mentions here of his journey in the field of political science and few of his contributions to this field. He has taught political science in Sir Parshuram College and Savitribai Phule Pune University ever since 1978 till 2016. He was the HOD of political science in Savitribai Phule Pune University during his tenure as HOD there. He ensured that his department will be rated as one of the best departments in the country. He is today a co-director of Lokaniti Research Program on Comparative Democracy based at CSDS, Delhi. He is associated with the National Election Study since the 1996 elections. He has also been involved in various research projects of Lokaniti focusing on study of public opinion in India. Professor Parshikar was one of the principal investigators of the international project on democracy in South Asia. Professor Parshikar writes in English and in Marathi on contemporary politics and has also written extensively in academic publications on the theme of democratic politics in India. He has many books in English as well in Marathi in his name as an author or as co-author or as an editor. He has been a frequent contributor to the daily newspapers and periodicals like Indian Express, EPW, The Outlook, India Today, Lokasatta, and other prestigious publications. He is the chief editor of Studies in Indian Politics, a biannual journal dedicated to the international research on politics. Besides participating in many international seminars, Professor Parshikar has been a visiting fellow at University of Chicago and Brown University. I think putting all this together, we can say that he has made a valuable and monumental contribution in the field of political science studies. As regards Ms. Smriti Kopikar, who is the moderator of this session, Ms. Kopikar is a veteran journalist. She has used her immaculate journalistic skills for multiple social causes, including urban and gender issues. She has contributed immensely in this field of journalism in different capacities. She has climbed up the career ladder from position of a correspondent to principal correspondent and from assistant editor to editor. The few of the prestigious publications she has worked for are the Hindustan Times, the Indian Express, the Statesman, India Today, and Outlook. She has uncovered, exposed many political and criminal conspiracies and contributed constructively to multifold social causes. She is presently working as an independent journalist and columnist. She is also engaged in building a new generation of committed journalists by opting to teach students of journalism in Sophia College and by way of writing for them. So it's over to you, Smriti, for the carrying out the further session.
Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to have Professor Suhas Parshikar, a person, an academic, a writer whose work I have admired and followed for a very long time, and who I keep often bugging at all times of the day to ask his opinion when we put journalism stories together. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome you, Professor Parshikar, to give an address. This is your turf. This is not, you are not being asked to give a quote. Professor Parshikar's writing would be familiar to almost all of us in this room. I must say that he's been exercised about issues of democracy and how democracy plays out for a very, very long time, for decades really. And today he's going to speak to us about a tangential perspective on democracy. He's going to talk to us about the impossibility of a centrist position, which is the crisis of Indian democracy. Professor Parshikar will speak for about half an hour or so. I don't think any of us will mind if he goes a little over that. And then once he finishes his remarks, I will come in and pick his brains a little bit, ask him a few questions on things he has said and things he may have left unsaid. So for the next half an hour or so, I'm handing this over to Professor Parshikar. All yours.
Thank you, Smriti. All the members of the Asiatic Society, particularly the Tikekar Center, Dr. Meenatai Vaishampayan, Dr. Usha Vijayalakshmi. Thank you, Pradeep, also for that kind introduction. And friends, I cannot claim to be a friend of Dr. Arun Tikekar, but I can say that we were fair acquaintances. And in spite of just being fair acquaintances, what Dr. Rajiv Naik said is perfectly what I recall. Any chance meeting, Tikekar would ask, so what are you doing? So he would never let you not do anything. And that activism, intellectual, makes me very proud to be associated with this fellowship award ceremony this evening. The topic that I'm going to speak about in the next half an hour or so, I'm sure is also something very close to the heart of Dr. Tikekar and his work and his overall approach. That is about the question of a centrist position, the possibility of finding a center where you can come together and talk to each other, maybe agree to disagree, as the typical liberal in Tikekar or any other liberal would probably say. So what I would do is, in the first few minutes, I would try to map out what I mean by this impossibility of a centrist position, and then raise 4 questions for this evening. The strategy of raising questions is only for the purpose that Smriti and you all won't ask me further questions, but you would introspect instead on why we have come to a pass where we find ourselves today. But let's first look at what is this impossibility. In the localities where we live, among colleagues, peers, it's very difficult, becoming very difficult to talk to each other frankly about public matters. In a sense, our conversation is getting reduced to formalities because our conversation cannot get into debatable issues. This is because, not because we don't have positions, but probably because there is an absence of a normative framework which we share with each other. Somebody has a different normative framework, I have a different normative framework, and therefore we just can't speak to each other. That is probably the impossibility of a centrist position in individual dialogues, conversations, debates, even committee meetings, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine how difficult it is going to get when it comes to really public affairs and the public realm. If you are operating in the public realm and making a certain statement, that statement, I'm sure, would be read by different persons in an entirely different way, and therefore different meanings would be drawn from the statements that we make. So much so that we can say that we have lost a common idiom. It's not just merely a question of a common framework, but also a common idiom, as if we were talking in different languages to each other. That is how probably our public life is steering towards. What someone like Tikekar would have ruled much more, perhaps, is a lack of nuance, as if there is a binary to everything, just this or that, nothing in between. And therefore, you either take this position or take that position, and nothing beyond that. This leads, both in our individual lives and in our public lives, a syndrome of you are either with me or against me. So the binary approach that we have cultivated is not restricted only to a lack of conversation among friends, but it is becoming a major public menace in our public life increasingly. And this is strange, simply because the character of India's politics generally over the years has been accommodative. The character of India's politics generally has been centrist. Now, this word centrist is somewhat fluid, but I'm using it for the time being, and maybe we can get into that later. But the character of India's politics and our public life have always been quite centrist. There is no place in Indian mindset and Indian public life, at least so far, to extremes. Extremes have always existed, but those extremes have always been described as extremes or fringe or peripheries, rather than the main grounds. The main grounds has always been accommodative, has always been centrist. So much so that even our constitution, as one judge in his ruling in the Mandal case pointed out, in the Indra Sawhney case, there was this judgment given by Justice Sawant, in which he pointed out that even the constitution strives at the golden mean. And if you stop for a moment and look at the constitution, you will find that the constitution also genuinely avoids becoming a manifesto of any sharp position. Instead, it is a manifesto of golden means, that as a society we should come together and find this common ground, find this common set of values on which we can hang our debates as a peg, at which we can fight with each other, at which political contestations might take place. And therefore, it is a strange phenomenon that we are now witnessing, where in spite of this background of centrism, centrism seems to be an improbable proposition in the near future, and particularly in the present moment. Which is also strange. For last quarter of a century, we have had the practice of coalition politics, as a result of which we have been accustomed to compromises. In fact, our media always gushes against those compromises, but I would say that coalitions have taught our political class this art of making compromises and art of finding common grounds. Why is it then? And that is the question, or that is the point with which I would probably begin to raise questions. But one is intrigued by this fact that why is it then that we find suddenly in a situation where compromises, negotiations seem to be impossible? But this is a larger question. To sort of break this question into specifics so that we can discuss those specifics, I would ask 4 questions. The first question I would ask is, how did this come about? How is it that we have moved from that position of centrism, that position of golden means, to the present? I have 2 answers to offer by way of an explanation to this question. How did this transformation come about? They are, of course, I'm going to place them before you in a very telegraphic manner, and also they are not the exhaustive answers. Nevertheless, they are important answers to my mind, and I think any exploration into finding out how this change has occurred, we need to find out these 2 factors and the way they have worked. The first, and for most of us sitting across in this Zoom meeting, this has been happening in the last quarter of a century, maybe 3 decades, and there has been very little awareness of this transformation, which is that our public opinion has been gradually shifting. From the 80s, late 80s, today, if we take these 2 points in time, late 80s and today, we find that there is a drastic shift in our public opinion. However, the moment you start teasing out that shift, you will notice that this transformation or shift was taking place step by step, gradually over a period of time. So our public opinion has shifted. And how has it shifted? It has shifted from accepting difference, that was something that we were used to till the 1980s, I would say, to looking forward to all uniformity. So from a position of accepting differences, we are now in a position where our public opinion actually encourages, incentivizes uniformity of opinions and many other things as well. Similarly, our public opinion has shifted from accepting criticisms or accepting various viewpoints to upholding loyalty as the exclusive virtue in public life. So there is a transformation in public life and in our public opinion. I will not really go into the details, but someone like me who has studied public opinion changes over a period of time, if one looks at different points in time, this difference becomes really striking. The second shift, or the second thing that has happened over this period, is about the location of hegemonic power. Societies always have hegemonic powers which control ideas, which control politics. So it's not the rise of hegemony which should alert us, but where is that hegemonic power located? That is the question. My answer would be that earlier, the hegemonic power used to be located somewhere near the center, and therefore centrism was possible. Whereas today, the hegemonic power's location has shifted from the center, away from the center, and as a result of that, the legitimacy of centrism is lost. Today, centrism is not legitimate simply because the hegemonic power is not located at the center. Instead, it is located away from the centrist position, and therefore taking a non-centrist position is the legitimate politics of the present moment. It is this dual trap of the shift in public opinion on the one hand and the shift in this location of hegemonic power on the other hand, which to my mind hold a key to how this change has come about. My second question would be, how does it relate to democracy? Although what I have said so far would have already sort of given you an idea of how this impinges on democracy, let me elaborate a little more on how it relates to democracy. I think we need to understand this, that democracy often is full of contradictory pulls and pushes. It is not seamless. On the one hand, democracy sort of or is something that facilitates inclusion. Democracy facilitates compromises, or democracy facilitates negotiations. This is something that democracy does, as a result of which in democracies, differences can be accommodated. And I am using the word differences in a very, very broad sense. They could be ideological or otherwise various other types of differences. So democracies can be homes to differences because they facilitate inclusion. They allow inclusion. But this is only one side of democracy. The other side of democracy is that just as it facilitates inclusion, democracy is also made up of this pull, which takes you in the direction of demonizing of differences. So democracy is not completely averse to this possibility that within a democracy, there would be demonization of differences, as a result of which democracy will consolidate exclusion rather than facilitating inclusion. These are contradictory pulls. And therefore, if one wants to understand how democracy has been played out in this country, we probably might have this as a paradigm as to when democracy allowed inclusion, when democracy encouraged inclusion, and when democracy began to facilitate exclusion as well. This is a dangerous game, therefore, democracy having these contradictory pulls, and the way democracy functions in our country seems to be a perfectly legitimate ground for this analysis. So that is the second thing. You may differ with this, but I think the overstatement about the virtue of democracy needs to be very guarded. We need to be very realistic about the possibilities of democracy. These possibilities of democracy have been quite well known right from the times of Tocqueville, who talked about the anxiety of American democracy. And all democratic thinkers have always been therefore anxious in which direction democracy will take societies. And will societies have the grit, will society have the willpower to actually turn democracy into an institution instrument of inclusion rather than an instrument of exclusion. My third question, effect of this kind of play of democratic politics in our midst, in India. If the contradictory pulls that I spoke about are abstract, theoretical, in reality, what happens is that these contradictory pulls actually change the nature of democracy in a given society. That is something that we have been witnessing in our country over the last 2.5 decades, or a little more than that, as a result of which, what has happened in India is that the middle ground on which all political debates would take place, that middle ground itself has changed now. In the sense, this is a corollary of what I said earlier about the shifting of public opinion. Following from the shift in public opinion, what has happened is that the middle ground of Indian politics has changed. At least in 3 respects, and I can list out many, but I would restrict myself to only 3 important changes and characteristics of our present middle ground. The first is, as I pointed out earlier, the new middle ground of India's public life is not averse to, not hesitant about excluding. This exclusion, whoever you may be excluding, this exclusion is not seen upon as something that doesn't fit into the scheme of things. So we have become unperturbed about exclusion. And by we, I really mean we, the society as a whole. This is not a party political issue. This is not a partisan issue. This is a societal characteristic that we are gradually evolving into. So the first, I would draw your attention to this unperturbed approach to exclusion. The second is the pushing of the individual to the periphery, not just an individual in the physical sense of the term, but the individual as an idea. What has happened is that in our normative hierarchy, we are not privileging the individual, but keeping the individual away, maybe on the second order or third order of our normative preferences. And that is where many of our present issues would connect. So it is this middle ground where you can't take a centrist position. You simply have to agree to this middle ground of where the individual is of a second order normative value. The third thing which has happened in the middle ground is that we now uphold the regime with R capital perhaps. So it's not just about the government, the idea of regime. We uphold the regime as the repository of moral superiority. And this is actually happening for the first time. I would spend a couple of minutes on this because maybe you will think that I am speaking too briefly about this. In all societies, the tendency towards exclusion is always present. So let us not deceive ourselves. Let us say that in our society also, the tendency of exclusion was always present. That tendency has now come to the middle ground. Similarly, in all societies, this dialectic between the individual as the important value and some idea of the collective as the important value is always present. And therefore, that also is not something very new. But something which is very new in our middle ground, and which is also something which sits very oddly with democracy as an idea, is this idea that the regime represents moral superiority. In a sense, we traveled a long way back into history, met with Hegel, and then imported Hegel without, of course, taking his name, and started saying that there is a repository of moral superiority in our society, and that repository. Now, if you have these 3 things in your middle ground of public life, then obviously the question with which we began simply becomes even more troublesome but simple to comprehend, namely the impossibility of taking a centrist position. Since we started this conversation in memory of Dr. Arun Tikekar, I am sure, and I'm sticking my neck out, that in the present moment, Tikekar would have been flabbergasted. Someone like Tikekar would have said that, oh, but then how do you take a centrist position in this situation? That is where we have come about. My final question, therefore, will be something which takes us all back to the memory of Dr. Arun Tikekar. But it is not just because of that memory that I am raising this question. I think theoretically what I have said leads us to this question. Whither liberalism? Where does this take liberalism to? And I am using this word liberalism with a lot of hesitation because it's also a good word and a bad word. It has so many meanings, and particularly when you prefix it with neo, it becomes a dirty word as well. So it's liberal position that we are talking about rather than liberalism as it was classically understood in the Western and particularly Anglo-Saxon tradition that one is talking about. If you take that liberty with the concept of the liberal and ask this question, where does it then go? What happens to a liberal approach or a liberal viewpoint? I think I would probably have no clear answer to this last bit, but I would venture with an answer and then stop. What happens in this present situation is this, and that's why I recalled how Tikekar would have been sort of at a loss at this particular juncture. There is only one possible outcome, probably, unless liberals and all those who hold liberal approach as important take up the challenge. Unless that happens, there is only one possibility. The possibility is that liberal would become extreme. It's a simple geographical kind of situation that if you move in one direction a long way, then the original position becomes an extreme, a periphery, an exotic position. So in our present, in all likelihood, the liberal has already become exotic, something extreme. I wanted actually to start with this, but I thought that I should not ruffle too many feathers right at the beginning. But the Asiatic Society and the Tikekar Fellowship Committee probably wouldn't know that in social media, I am every day accused of being an urban Nakshal. Now, I can assure you, of course, that I have written against the idea of Maoism. I have pointed out at the difficulties that they have created, etc., etc. But the point is that, why am I being called an urban Nakshal? In my defense, I would say that I am where I was 10 years ago as well. But because the ground shifted away, I become someone who is taking an exotic position or an extreme position, depending upon where you look upon me as. This is one possibility as far as liberalism is concerned or liberal approach is concerned. The second possibility is that a liberal approach would be probably now meaning, it would simply mean a more sophisticated expression of the middle ground. It would be a very sad day in the life of liberal approach if a sophisticated expression of the middle ground is itself called the liberal. This is the problem that liberalism faces. In other words, the crisis is so much a crisis of Indian democracy as also the crisis of taking a liberal stand on various socially contested issues. How do we face this is a challenge to everyone who is concerned with democracy, who is also concerned with taking a centrist position. Let me close by saying only this, that this therefore is a moment of challenge for those who think that centrist and liberal stand is necessary for democracies to thrive. For them, the challenge is not just to reiterate that liberal stand is important, but to actually rediscover that liberal standpoint. Because the old liberal standpoint has lost its attraction, has lost its legitimacy, but most importantly, it has lost its political traction. It doesn't have political traction. And therefore, it's a huge challenge. It's not just taking a middle of the road position. The larger challenge is actually to adopt a certain democratic ethic, which is informed by a liberal, or I should add actually radical liberal position. And that search for radical liberal position is a challenge both of a theoretical nature and a political nature for those who believe that democracies, if they want to survive from those two contradictory pulls that I mentioned, need to also have a liberal anchor. Unless democracies have that liberal anchor, they probably cannot handle those two contradictory pulls. I would stop here because, as I guaranteed you at the beginning, I was here only to raise these questions rather than to make any answers which would sound to you somewhat grand or somewhat too ordinary. I would leave those answers to you, and maybe what we can do in the remainder of the time is only to keep asking more questions, because after all, is it not that asking questions is one of the central characteristics of a liberal standpoint? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Parshikar. As always, you have ticked off so many boxes and forced us to look at the issue in a new light. In fact, many new lights, I would say. It was extremely thoughtful, thought-provoking presentation that you made, and the fact that you threw questions at us, sir, actually doesn't mean you get to not answer those questions. So I'm going to begin by asking you a question, and for the audience, unfortunately, we cannot take direct questions for Professor Parshikar for lack of time, because we wanted to finish this within 80 to 90 minutes or so. But if there are comments, I suppose Professor Parshikar would be reading those comments, and as he says, he has given us food for thought. But as part of this discussion, let me begin by asking you, Professor Parshikar, the link that you have drawn between centrist position, between the middle ground, democracy and liberalism, that link is, I think, historically proven now. And when you say that the middle ground has shifted, the center has shifted, and therefore with a liberalism. I want to ask you, if you were to reclaim the liberal position, if you were to reclaim some part of this lost or erasing middle ground, where would you begin? What would you do?
That also happens to be a question in a different words asked by Vasanti Damle. Let me try. I'm not sure I can answer that question where to begin. But there are always, since we are not talking only of concepts but of public life, there are always multiple beginnings that are required. And one beginning obviously has to be, as I said, in the realm of introspection on the part of the liberals, introspection and also redefinition of liberalism. Something, the word radical liberalism that I used at the end, because it takes us back to the first radical liberal probably in our Indian tradition, Jyotiba Phule. So it would take us back to Jyotirao Phule, and that is where you actually find that for the purposes of collective good, you employ the question of individual dignity. So Phule does not raise the question of individual dignity in a vacuum. It is a value, sure, but it is a value with a purpose. And the purpose obviously is not the individual dignity of the upper half of the society, but the lower half of the society. If you don't want to go back into Phule, perhaps you can come more close to our present. And only day before yesterday, we celebrated the, and I'm using the word celebrated not as a slip of tongue, celebrated the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi, commemorated the death of Mahatma Gandhi. So you can go back to Mahatma Gandhi's position. And then again, you will find that he doesn't find this as a problem. The connection between the individual as an idea, but the last man as the objective. I think somewhere liberalism loses this connect with the last man, or liberalism loses this connect with the lower half of the society, bottom half of the society, as a result of which it becomes a kind of hanging and unsituated ideology. That's why I think in the present moment, we need to actually go back to the drawing board and find out what are those connections. Obviously, as I said, there are multiple openings, and the other one has to be a conversation in the realm of politics itself. And that conversation, of course, will definitely be a very complicated conversation. It won't be really a conversation, as all of us know, but whatever word it is, that will have to be engaged with.
Sure. I'm taking this to a larger arc, as it were, to pose this question to you. You laid out very well the way the middle ground has shifted, and how the centrist position itself has become non-feasible or untenable or non-fashionable. It's no longer good. It's not seen as being a desirable position to hold, to be a centrist. But when we look at the world, we realize that this is not true only of India, because you titled this as a crisis of Indian democracy. I think a very quick glance at the world would show us that if this is a crisis, and I do believe it's a crisis, this crisis is true of large parts of the world that practice democracy, where democracy is being challenged by illiberalism, where center is no longer what it used to be, and the centrist or liberal position is, I would go to the extent of saying, a dirty and undesirable position to have. Would you agree with this, that India is not exceptional in the sense that this is happening in other democracies as well? So in a sense, the entire world has moved towards the right or the left or whichever side.
I would absolutely agree with you. The only reason I titled this as Crisis of India's Democracy is simply because one way of analyzing this larger crisis could be starting with India. The other way would be actually taking a non-India and therefore universal kind of perspective and looking at what is happening to democracy. Two quick answers to why I did this. One is simply because only recently I had given a speech in which half of the speech was devoted to this larger and, as you say, more universal question as to what is happening to democracy globally and how one can understand it. And that has now been published in the Sadhana Weekly. So I thought that rather than repeating the same thing, let me approach it only from the India perspective. The second and more specific reason is that I think the pathology of this crisis would still be different country-wise. While the larger issue is absolutely right, that there is a crisis, and the larger issue is also that democracy itself has lost much of its shine over the last couple of decades. True, if you start visiting country by country, you will find that there would still be country specifics. And in India, I think, and I thought when I gave this title, that in the Indian context, it is this increasing stifling of the idea of a centrist position, which I think in spite of Trump, will still not be very true of the United States, where you would still have the Democrats and the Republicans coming together on at least some issues, and so on and so forth. So you can start looking at what is specifically happening to the USA, what is specifically happening to France, and so on and so forth. France, the regime actually is wanting to shift the middle ground, whereas in India, the middle ground changed and then a regime change occurred. So the trajectories are different, routes are different, and therefore also the remedies will have to be somewhat specific to what our country faces. And in our country, I thought that in the public life, leave out politics as such, in the public life, taking a centrist position itself is becoming increasingly difficult. And that's why I thought that I should take up this only for India's sake.
Right. I think you put it very, very well. I am shifting I'm shifting gears slightly to bring this discussion and link it to the idea of a public domain in a democracy, public discourse that happens in that domain, and the media, which is something both you and I are a part of, and many here in this room also are a part of. And I think Ms. Zai Vipra mentioned something when she started her position about the clampdown that happened today as we speak, the kind of clampdown that's happening on a social media platform. Like you, I often get very colorful abuses for the positions that I take. People find them either too extreme or not good enough, or me not valuable enough to be an Indian anymore. So I'm linking this to the idea that a democracy is never a democracy unless there is a very robust, sturdy, large public domain in which there is a maybe a noisy and chaotic, but there is a very robust public discourse. You and I, if we disagree, we should be able to disagree vociferously, debate on each and every minor point, and be able to go back with our positions enriched or shifted. Either you convince me or I convince you in a democracy. What we find here in India in the last few years is that this public discourse has either been vitiated by a very peculiar kind of ad hominem attacks, personal attacks, or the public discourse is stifled by media companies, and media forms a large part of the public discourse. And now it's not just the media companies, but also the social media companies which stifle or clamp down on public discourse. So my question to you really is, if we could discuss this a little bit, when we aim to or hope to reclaim the middle ground, reclaim the center, as it were, we really can't do it unless we restore the public domain, restore the respect and robustness in our public discourse, isn't it? Or am I completely off the mark in thinking this?
No, I wouldn't say that you are off the mark. I would simply say that the relationship between the two, let's say politics as such and public domain that we are talking about, this relationship is a twofold or to and fro relationship. In the sense, the public domain is primary, and we need to first occupy that in order to have a liberal standpoint, some validity. But at the same time, as I pointed out, democratic politics as they have a tendency of even pushing the public domain into a certain direction. And since we are talking about this, there is this interesting point made here by Ramu Ramanathan, who has pointed out to the Putin interview in the Financial Times, not Putin interview, it is interview with Financial Times editors, I'm sorry, where he points out that according to Putin, the idea of liberalism is obsolete in the 21st century. And the point Ramu Ramanathan is making is that Putin concludes the interview by saying, we are living in a world where there are no rules anymore. Now, this idea probably has various echoes and reverberations in different societies. While on the one hand, there are no rules anymore, there could be your rules and my rules, or there could be my rules only. And Putin would probably be saying ultimately that he makes the rules, he gets to make the rules. It is this, what shall we say, this very undisciplined, or let's say very chaotic approach to the idea of rules, which is really very important, because finally, in both democracy and a liberal approach, a certain respect for rules is always recognized as the baseline. That you, as you pointed out, you have differences, but you would still agree on certain baselines. And I started by saying that our languages now appear to be different. Therefore, when you quote a rule, I have a different meaning of that rule in my mind. When you quote a word, I have a totally different meaning of that word in my mind. And therefore, we might be appearing as speaking the same language and the same idiom, but with different meanings altogether. Now, this is the difficulty of the public domain or public life generally that you have been talking about. What we need to do, therefore, is not merely a question of increasing the culture of decorum. It's not decorum. It's actually a more fundamental agreement about what you mean. You may not like a certain value, let's say the value of religiosity or the value of secularism or the value of socialism. But unless there is an agreement about these terms, there cannot be a conversation in a social or public context. And we have lost that ability to evolve common meanings. And I'm saying that this has not happened all of a sudden. This has happened over last 3 decades, starting with the late 1980s. So it's a long period. Liberals or centrists were taken off guard. Only decades they or we, whichever way you think, wrong is happening. As a result of which, these small amendments couldn't be made to our public life in time. And today, there is this breach in our public life, which happens to be such a remarkable breach that it doesn't happen to be something that you can bridge within a day, within a year, or within one lecture, or so on and so forth.
Right. Right. And of course, there is the role of propaganda, which has been raised to a status of some sort of a cult. And I find increasingly that the value that the society placed on free, fair, and independent journalism, that value now seems to be transferring to a vicious propagandist kind of spread of information. But I'm just bringing this back to, of course, we are discussing democracy and centrist positions at a more intellectual level and less at a political level. But centrism, at the end of the day, tries to place itself in relation to the left and the right, the political left and the political right. And both these extremes are very clear in their ideological positions, right? And they're able to articulate it extremely well and in language and in ways that probably capture public or popular imagination. Would you say that this, and centrism on the other hand, tries to be everything to everybody, maybe ideologically agnostic, if I could call it that. Pretty much ideologically agnostic. I can lean a little bit towards the right, a little bit towards the left, depending on the issue. And therefore, do you think the idea of being ideologically agnostic, or I use this word very cautiously, the idea of being neutral? Neutrality is a very difficult word to use often in these kinds of discussions, because in certain societies, you know, neutrality always helps the oppressor or the regime or whatever. So, but I'm using it in a more political way. Is it that centrism becomes difficult because it is ideologically agnostic, cannot take or does not take ideologically hard positions? Is neutral in the sense that it is accommodative, can take you in and can take you in, and a little bit of what we saw during India's freedom struggle, right? So people of all shades were part of that struggle, and in that sense, the middle ground was, I would think, was really very vibrant and large at that point in India's history. Do you think this is one reason that centrism begins to lose its appeal at a time that either the right or the left begin to become fashionable? Because it's not hardcore about anything. It doesn't articulate itself very well. It's pretty ideologically agnostic, tries to be neutral. So it means everything to everybody or nothing to nobody. Is that an issue with centrism?
No, I would say the first part, for the first half of your question first, that yes, left, right, and center is a very common imagery that we evolve. But probably what we are talking about here now is less about that centrism and more about the ability to become or remain pragmatic in times of contestations. Between the left and the right, or between any two. Left and right are actually our baggage, intellectual baggage from the French Revolution's times, and also from the time of the Cold War in a sense. And sooner we sort of drop that baggage, the better. But yes, there are always ideological positions. Centrism, I wouldn't think, is an ideological position. Centrism is, I would think, a question of political practice. How you practice your politics, and it is there, or how you practice your conversation, for that matter, in public domain. That art is something which I am labeling as centrism, for want of a better term. I am not saying, for example, that centrism means being sort of equidistant from left and right. That can't be, and that need not be. Following from this, then, I would say that the idea of neutrality also needs to be understood very cautiously, because we are not neutral in the sense that we are sitting in judgment on something in a neutral fashion. Neutrality would here refer to a certain steadfast commitment to certain values. And from those value perspectives, my neutrality would say that if, let us say, party or group A or B are doing the wrong thing today, I would speak out against them. I am not against them because I am politically positioned against them in the contest for politics, but I am speaking against them because their practice or their ideas run against the values that I hold to be important to me and to the society as well. Not just to me, but in my mind and in my mental map, they are important for the society. That's why I would say that I'm opposed to them. You can always take concrete examples, but concrete examples have always a tendency of slipping into details rather than being only instances or examples. The point is, let us say this entire thing that has happened in Myanmar, for example. Any Democrat, what would have any Democrat done so far? From this position that we are talking about, the neutral position, a Democrat would have said earlier, maybe yesterday or day before yesterday, that to the extent the elected representative of or the elected leader of Myanmar represents the people, I would respect her right to rule. But at the same time, the way she is ruling is bad for the country and bad for democracy. So I will oppose her. The same neutral person would say today that by the same token, the intervention by the military is wrong because that is something which I don't think fits into the things of liberal democratic politics. Now here I am not taking any permanent position vis-a-vis Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi, but evaluating her actions on the basis of principles that I hold to be important. So if I am sort of criticizing the military takeover in Myanmar, I am not siding with her. If I am criticizing the military takeover of Pakistan tomorrow, that shouldn't be seen that I am siding with Imran Khan, but I am siding with democracy and therefore civilian rule. Civilian rule being important to me, I am opposing military rule.
And this takes me into the realm of another level of academic discussion for which I'm told we don't have the time, but hopefully you and I can continue this conversation later, which is basically that a centrist position can either be, one can either be a very principled centrist, where positions are taken on basis of values and ideas of liberty and so on and so forth. Or one can be a functional centrist where some things are okay at some point and the same thing doesn't become okay depending on the context. I think there are many questions and sub-questions that arise from what you've said and what we've spoken. It would have been great to continue, but we do have a bell going off in some time, I guess.
I understand.
But thank you very much. I hope people have taken something off from this discussion. And Professor Parshikar, I do want to say that I know you said impossibility of a centrist position, but I live in the hope that centrist will never be an undesirable or a dirty word in the Indian democracy, and it will be possible to reclaim centrism and the middle ground.
I would be happy if that happens.
Thank you. Thank you very
much. And thanks to all the organizers and the Asiatic Society for this opportunity. I hope that I have not disappointed you entirely. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. We just heard a very intellectually stimulating and vibrant discussion. And often when I read Professor Parshikar, the reading never stops with just single reading. I go back and forth, to an earlier paragraph or even through paragraph before, or sometimes, go back and read from the start. So basically, because of this stimulating intellectual arguments he keeps making in his articles, and I got that first time I heard him, and I'm very, so what I'm going to do is going back to the recording and actually listening to it again. Thank you very much, sir.
I'm sorry about that.
Thank you very much, sir. And so we are now close to the end of a program. I would now like to invite Dr. Usha Vijayalakshmi to propose word of thanks.
Yeah, thank you. After a riveting session, it is time for a formal vote of thanks. It is an occasion to cherish the time we spent with Dr. Arun Tikekar. First and foremost, I wish to thank all the members who attend this program every year. I thank our chief guest, Professor Parshikar, for delivering speech on a pertinent topic, which is a dilemma that many face in public life. I thank Dr. Rajiv Nayak, our jury, for giving his remarks on the issue. I congratulate Ms. Zai Vipra for receiving this year's Dr. Arun Tikekar's Memorial Research Fellowship. I thank Dr. Usha Thakkar, Mr. Kumar Ketkar, Ms. Irina Glushkova, and our former President Sharad Kale for attending the program. I thank the members of Dr. Tikekar's family for attending the program. I thank Mr. Eknath Shirsagar, our Chairman of Board of Trustees, for attending this program. I thank our President, Professor Vispi Balapuria, for being with us. I thank our office bearers for their presence. Once again, thank you all. Stay home, stay safe, and good night.